He arrived before sunrise, as he had every day for almost 4 years. The streets of Austin were still silent when Henry Dawson unlocked the revolving door of the Westmore Tower, one of the most sophisticated buildings in the business district. He wore his impeccably pressed navy blue uniform, with polished buttons and polished shoes, reflecting the cold light from the entrance. His face was serene, his posture straight, and he had a certain air of discreet nobility, as if he had seen the whole world, but preferred to remain silent. At 6:42 a.m., he would take his place, ready to open doors and say good morning to faces that would never look back at him. One by one, executives would hurry past, talking on the phone, adjusting their ties, complaining about the traffic, as if Henry were part of the architecture, a functional part of the building, and not a human being. He would smile anyway, always, even when no one responded. That morning, the hallway was already buzzing before 7. The anticipation of an international meeting filled the air, but Henry knew his place. He heard the whispered comments. "Today is the day to impress the Europeans. I hope the interpreter doesn't make any mistakes. The CEO is on edge." Henry heard it all, but he said nothing. Then a young intern, late and nervous, bumped into the counter and spilled coffee on the floor. The liquid ran down like a small, silent disaster. He just muffled a damn and ran away. No apology. No word to Henry, who silently grabbed the old rag from the cupboard and crouched down. His knees hurt, his back felt heavy, but he cleaned everything up calmly, just like he had done since day one. Have you ever felt invisible in a place where everything is happening around you, but nothing seems to notice you? Henry knew what it was like. Since returning from the war, he had heard many doors slammed. He tried to return to his normal life. He tried to offer his resume, his experience, his fluency in 5 languages. But the corporate world thought he was too old, too technical, out of touch. A former soldier as a doorman? Makes sense, some said. And he accepted, because he needed to survive. But what no one there knew was that the man who opened glass doors had also opened paths in war zones. That his voice had saved lives when he accurately translated the surrender of an entire group of civilians in the Middle East. That he knew the codes, the tones, the gestures. But that no one ever asked. On the wall behind his small post, they hung a board with the building's rules. No one knew that inside the battered briefcase he carried every day were copies of medals, letters of thanks, and even a note signed by a former president. But he never showed them. Because he learned in war that the greatest achievements are those that no one needs to applaud. Still, there were days when the pain of invisibility was stronger. Like when he heard 2 employees whispering near the elevator. "He seems so quiet. I wonder if he can read." Henry just pretended he didn't hear. But it hurt. What those people didn't know, what nobody in that building I imagined, was that that gentleman with a firm gaze and slow steps carried a past that could change everything. And that morning, something very simple, almost insignificant, would begin to turn the game around. Something that would happen in the lobby, in front of everyone. But only Henry would be able to understand. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover may surprise you, and perhaps make you look at the invisible people around you differently. Because the hero of this story has not yet been recognized, and the way it happens, it will mess with you. The smell of an old microwave filled the break room, as Henry sat down, as usual, in the corner of the cracked formica table. He brought with him the same lunchbox he had every day. White rice, 2 pieces of cold chicken, and yesterday's wilted vegetables. As he chewed slowly, the noise around him seemed to come from another world. The laughter of the younger generation, the comments about TV series, and the inside jokes he never understood, or rather that he pretended not to understand, made the room feel even more cramped than it already was. No one there knew that Henry had already translated secret missions in war zones, where a mistaken intonation could cost the lives of an entire platoon. There, in the company, his nickname was simple and dry. The Doorman. Never Henry. never Senior Dawson. Just the guy at the door. And even when someone called him, it was with that automatic, impersonal tone, like someone talking to a machine. "Hey, is there water in the drinking fountain?" "Doorman, can you take the elevator down to number 5 for me?" One time, during a corporate event, Henry was organizing the police tape in the lobby when he heard a group of executives chuckling softly. "That guy looks like he barely finished high school." They laughed. One of them added, "If speaking English is already difficult, imagine using an Excel spreadsheet." Henry just followed, pulling the tape as if he hadn't heard anything. But the laughter kept ringing in his mind all day. What those men in suits didn't know was that Henry had been trained by the best communications agents in military intelligence, that he had learned to speak French while negotiating the release of hostages at a hidden base in northern Chad, that he had learned Arabic while living with displaced families in Middle Eastern villages, while teaching children to write their names with sticks in the sand. But in that building, all of that was reduced to a cold lunchbox, a badge with no surname, and silence. Always silence. One time, the HR manager walked by the break room and, seeing Henry with a paperback book in French, frowned and asked dismissively, "Are you studying, mister?" "Henry, have you tried a basic English course to help out with the people here?" He just smiled. But inside, a piece of the past screamed. Because it hurt more than the sound of gunfire he had heard in Afghanistan. It hurt more than the days he had to feign neutrality while translating cruel orders. It hurt because, there, in that office full of educated people, he was considered inferior. Inferior for having an accent. Inferior because he is old. Inferior for not being part of the club. But no one there knew that Henry still carried, in the old wallet hidden in the inside pocket of his jacket, the faded photograph of an Afghan boy. A boy he had saved with a simple phrase in Dari, spoken with the calm of someone who had seen the worst. It was this same photo he looked at on his darkest days, when the contempt came unfiltered, when someone walked by him and spoke slowly, as if explaining something to an illiterate person, when the smiles disappeared as soon as he approached the conversation. Henry learned to keep quiet. But keeping quiet is not the same as forgetting. And all this contempt, all this silencing, was accumulating like dust beneath the door of the soul. Until something started to change. Slowly. It all started on a morning that seemed ordinary, but that would bring a sequence of events capable of breaking this silence. And the first person to notice was the new intern, who dropped the papers at the reception desk when he saw Henry answering something in Spanish to a delivery man. The young man stopped. His eyes widened, but said nothing. The doorman just went back to his chair, with the same calm, with the same distant look, as if nothing had happened, but something inside had been unlocked. And the hidden truth that Henry had been carrying for so long began, without warning, to spill out through the cracks. This building, accustomed to ignoring its most valuable stories, was about to witness something rare. A silent but impossible to ignore transformation. It's just that certain talents, no matter how much they are pushed behind the scenes, don't accept being buried forever. And Henry, even tired, even invisible, even crushed by suspicious looks, still had something that no one there had. The real experience of someone who saved lives with words, not weapons. And from here on, the story begins to take a turn that not even the directors of this company could have predicted. The revolving doors were non-stop that morning. The coming and going in the lobby sounded like an orchestra of expensive shoes, leather briefcases, and vibrating cell phones. The entire building breathed tension. Henry, as always, stood at his post, his eyes alert and his hands clasped behind his back. He noticed the fast pace, the muffled conversations, the restless glances. There was something different in the air, and he could smell the nervousness, even under the expensive cologne of the executives. The group of foreign businessmen arrived with military precision, all in dark suits with firm posture, some with the frown of those who expected more than a clean carpet. They sat in the marble reception area, in calculated silence, watching the movement. It was $1 billion contract, an international agreement that could change the course of the company. But in the midst of that corporate theater, an unexpected absence threw everything into disarray. The interpreter. The young assistant, completely lost, was the first to panic. He was sweating on his forehead, frantically trying to call someone, stumbling over his own words and muttering under his breath, "Where is this guy? Where is this guy?" The CEO, Mr. Ramsey, stepped out of the elevator with his leather briefcase and a look of indifference. One look at his sweaty assistant, and the tense room was enough to tell him the meeting was about to turn into a disaster. The foreigners spoke to each other in French, German, Italian, and Arabic. They tried to decipher the situation, but it all sounded like noise to the employees around them. Until one of them, a Frenchman with his jacket half open and a slight tone of irony in his voice, said something out loud, facing the reception. "This building is clearly not prepared for international markets." The phrase fell into the air as an elegant but cruel criticism. It was at that moment that a voice answered, clear, calm, natural. "We apologize for the inconvenience. We will begin in a moment." The silence that followed lasted for long seconds. The voice came from where no one expected it. Henry, the doorman. He didn't move. He just spoke. With a clean accent, a sharp enunciation, with the confidence of someone who had done this before, many times. Everyone looked up. One of the Italian businessmen stood up, curious, and asked a quick question. Henry responded in the same tone, switching to Italian as if changing radio stations. Within seconds, he was mediating a conversation between 5 different nationalities, each more demanding than the last. The assistant choked on his water. The CEO froze. The receptionists looked at each other in confusion. And Henry just kept going. It was as if a forgotten part of him had awakened. In that lobby, for the first time in years, he wasn't the doorman. He was the man who was solving a problem that no one there could face. But inside, something still hurt. Because it wasn't the first time he had saved a situation with his words, and the other times, no one had even remembered his name. Flashbacks tore through his mind as he spoke fluently. The small room where he had translated a call for help from a besieged desert base. The look of panic on the soldier's face as he needed Henry to speak to the rebels before the outpost was attacked. The butterflies in his stomach before he had uttered, in a firm voice, the exact phrase that would ensure a peaceful surrender. He saw blood dripping from broken radios. He saw children hiding under makeshift tents. He saw men kneeling, waiting to die, until he said the right words. And now, there he was, resolving a scheduling delay for executives wearing leather shoes and imported coffee. But no one there knew that, behind that calm voice, there was a history that was never valued. When he finished lining up the last details of the meeting, he calmly turned to the CEO and said respectfully, "They are ready, sir." It was the first time Mr. Ramsey had been left without an answer. The businessmen headed to the conference room, relieved. The contract was not lost. The company had been saved, but not by the person everyone expected. And then the real turnaround begins. It wasn't the meeting itself that changed everything. It was what happened afterward. What the CEO decided to investigate. The questions he started asking. And most importantly, the answers he found. Because that man who everyone treated like hallway furniture carried a hidden truth on his shoulders. A story that no one there was prepared to hear, but that needed to be told. Write in the comments. Now it all makes sense. Because only those who have been ignored understand the weight of finally being seen. The elevator was still open when the CEO stopped in the middle of the lobby, unable to blink. The clock read 9:12, but time seemed frozen. A doorman had just restored order to an international meeting that had been planned for weeks. Alone. No script, no title, no status. Just his voice, and a calmness that you can't buy in any MBA. Henry returned to the counter with the same posture he always had. Hands behind his back, eyes alert, expression neutral. But inside, something was stirring. An old, forgotten kind of warmth. As if the body remembered, before the mind, what it was to have purpose. For a few minutes, no one approached him. Not even to ask. Not even to thank him. It was the afternoon security guard, Peter, who broke the silence. "Man, do you really say all that?" Henry smirked. "It depends on what that is." Peter scratched his head. "French, Spanish, whatever. That thing you did." "Ah, yeah, I learned a few bits and pieces from there." And that was it. But from the 18th floor, the CEO was watching. Later that day, as Henry ate his cold chicken in the cafeteria, 2 men in suits came down to the lobby. One of them, a direct aide to Mr. Ramsay, introduced himself. "Could you come up for a minute?" Henry wiped his hands on a napkin and nodded. The elevator rose slowly. It was the first time Henry had entered the elevator without having pressed the button for another passenger. The elevator mirrors reflected his image, his simple suit, his tired face, his weather-beaten shoulders. In the CEO's office, the view of the city seemed larger than he remembered. The company boss stood up, offered a chair and a glass of water. He said directly, "Where did all this come from, Henry?" "Sir, those languages, that tranquility, that authority." For a moment, Henry hesitated. He was tired of explaining himself. But there was something different about the way Ramsay looked at him. It wasn't judgment. It was genuine curiosity. So he told him. He said he served in the armed forces for almost 3 decades. He was an interpreter in conflict zones where getting a verb wrong could mean the death of innocent people. He learned 5 languages: French, Spanish, Italian, German, and Arabic. Not in courses, but on the streets, in the villages, in makeshift tents amidst bombs and dust. He told of the mission in Sudan, where he negotiated the release of 7 hostages without firing a shot. The time he was the only link between a commander and a rebel faction, saving the entire base from a massacre. But he also told what came next. The return to the country. The silence. The frustration. I would hand in my resume and hear, "You have too much experience for this position," or "Your age doesn't fit the pace of our company." After a while, I stopped trying. I accepted what was offered to me. The CEO remained silent. Henry continued, "I'm not a hero. I did my job. But here, no one ever cared." He took a small leather wallet from his inside pocket. From it, he pulled out a yellowed letter, dated 2008, signed by a colonel. It was a formal thank you. "Your actions were crucial to the survival of Unit 217. Your fluency, courage, and poise saved lives." Ramsay read silently. He took a deep breath. And then he said, "You should be somewhere else within this company." But Henry just shrugged. "Here at the reception. No one needs me to talk quickly or explain myself. They just expect me to open the door." The CEO closed the letter and handed it back respectfully. "Maybe it's time to open other doors, Henry." But down there, not everyone thought so. When he returned to the ground floor, 2 employees were whispering near the guardhouse. One of them from the IT department laughed. "Now the old man wants to become an executive? Are you going to give a lecture? In Arabic?" The laughter was muffled, but Henry heard it, and he swallowed hard. Because the worst kind of prejudice isn't the one that's shouted. It's the one that comes with smiles, with condescension, with that look of someone who pretends to praise you, but is actually pushing you back into the corner. That day, when he got home, Henry didn't turn on the TV. He sat in the living room chair and stared at a shelf full of medals stored in boxes. No one at the company knew that he had already received recognition from NATO, that he had already translated for a US ambassador in the field. But there, between those walls, it all seemed like part of another life. The problem wasn't being invisible. It was being remembered only as the one who serves, never as the one who knows. Still, there was something that wouldn't go away, the certainty that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But fate wasn't ready to leave him alone. Because the next day, a decision by the CEO would change everything, and Henry's name would start circulating behind the scenes with force. Curiosity grew, rumors spread, and a silent transformation began to take shape within the company. Write in the comments, not every giant makes noise. Because some just need the right chance to show who they always were. The next morning began like any other. The sun was shining through the glass of the lobby, and the first employees were crossing the threshold, while Henry was already there, as always. In his ironed uniform, and with his posture straight, he opened the door with the same calm and professional gesture he had repeated for years. But inside, everything was different. Just hours earlier, he had revealed the most intimate part of his story. Not to show off, but because, for the first time since he had returned to his country, someone had looked him in the eye and said, "I want to understand who you really are." That simple phrase echoed in his mind more powerfully than any applause he had ever received in the past. It was the kind of listening he had never had since leaving the military. But outside of that conversation, the corporate world was much the same. People continued to pass through it as if nothing had changed. And in a way, it hadn't, at least not yet. While he was working at the reception, he heard a marketing employee whispering to another in the elevator. "Did you hear? The CEO talked to the doorman yesterday. Maybe he'll give him an honor roll." The other laughed. "Yeah, that must have been exciting. I wonder if he fought Rambo too." Henry heard. He pretended not to, but it cut deep. Because the pain of being discredited after everything he had been through was greater than any war wound. War hurts the body. Indifference hurts identity. And perhaps worst of all was the fact that, despite the revelations of the night before, he still didn't know if anything would actually change. The conversation had been respectful, yes, but how many conversations had he had that ended in nothing? How many times had he been heard, but never remembered? On his way home that night, he stopped in front of a closed newsstand. The dirty glass reflected his face next to a headline that read, "New Bilingual Generation Leads Promising Startups." Henry just lowered his head and walked on. Because knowing a lot was never enough for those who don't have the right profile. At home, he sat in the same chair he always had. He took out the letters he had kept. The one that stood out the most to him was from a Syrian girl he had helped rescue from a bombing zone. The shaky handwriting read, "Thank you for talking to the soldiers for me. Thank you for understanding me. You are my hero without a uniform." He put the letter back in the envelope, folded it slowly, and placed it between his books. But the next day, something began to move behind the scenes at the company. Quietly. The CEO, contrary to what everyone imagined, had not forgotten the conversation. He was obsessed with finding out why no one ever knew who Henry really was. Worse, why no one ever wanted to know. In the corridors of the 18th floor, the topic was spread like a whisper. Does the old man have a degree? Is it true that he translated for the military? That must be an exaggeration. The doubt was bothersome. And this exposed the collective discomfort. The fear that someone considered simple was, in fact, much greater than everyone there. Meanwhile, Henry continued with his routine. He went up and down the lobby, directed visitors, called the elevator, and responded kindly. Even with the whispers. Even with the dirty looks. Even with the tiredness. But that afternoon, a discreet envelope arrived at his guardhouse. Letterhead. Internal invitation. Subject, confidential meeting. He read it once. He read it again. He felt his heart race, but he didn't let it show. He just adjusted the collar of his uniform and confirmed his presence. At the appointed time, he went up again. And this time, he found the CEO with 2 other directors. In the center of the room, an open folder. Inside it, copies of his military records, awards, and photos of classified operations that had now been declassified. Everything authenticated. Everything confirmed. The director of institutional relations cleared his throat. "Mr. Dawson, this is impressive. But the question is, Why haven't you ever shown it? Henry stared at him. No anger, just truth. Because no one ever asked. The answer fell like a stone to the ground. The CEO took a deep breath and stepped forward. Henry, with your experience, we can't keep you at the front desk. I'm creating a position for you. International Relations and Multicultural Training Consultant. The silence lasted longer than expected. Henry took a while to answer. Not because of doubt, but because of a movie that was playing in his head. The no's from other companies. The tight uniform. The feeling of being forgotten by those he served. But at that moment, something inside him shifted, as if a weight had finally been returned to where it should never have been. With a slight nod, he accepted. And the next day, write in the comments, finally, someone saw it. Because this kind of recognition is not just a prize. It is justice being served, even if it is too late to erase everything that was ignored. On the morning that everything officially changed, Henry arrived an hour early, as he always did. But this time, without his blue uniform. He was wearing a light-colored dress shirt, a gray blazer, and a look that mixed tranquility with something new. Restored dignity. When he crossed the building's entrance, he didn't go straight to the guardhouse. He walked toward the elevators with firm steps, the badge hanging around his neck now displaying a new title, International Relations and Multicultural Training Consultant. Some employees stopped to watch. An older security guard gave a small, shy wave. The receptionist smiled awkwardly. But there were those who turned up their noses. An IT coordinator, visibly uncomfortable, commented to a colleague, "Look there, the new Dr. Henry. Is he going to teach French now?" There are people who only grow through shouting or through pity. But Henry didn't need answers. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. The truth is that he had already crossed deserts with sand in his eyes and bombs all around him. He had already remained lucid when most people lost control. And he had already been discredited by people who, deep down, would never have endured half the journey he had traveled. In that new room on the 17th floor, small but bright, he placed a discreet frame on the wall. It wasn't a diploma, nor a trophy. It was the same letter written by that Syrian girl, now framed. That was all he needed to remember who he was and why he was still here. During the first week, the lectures were short, internal, and for selected teams. But soon the impact began to spread. Henry didn't speak like a professor. He spoke like someone who had lived it. And that captured anyone's attention. He explained, for example, the importance of active listening between cultures. But before that, he told how he once had to decipher a gesture made by a tribal leader before a negotiation that would determine the fate of 38 civilians. A simple raising of the eyebrows that, if misinterpreted, could be seen as an insult. And when a young executive scoffed, saying, "But that doesn't apply in today's digital marketplace," Henry just smiled. And asked, "Have you ever sold something to someone who grew up afraid to speak their mind?" The room fell silent, but what bothered the resistors the most was not the content. It was the respect he was beginning to generate. It was seeing younger people, with MBAs on their resumes, listening to that gray-haired man as if he were a map. Because in the end, that's what Henry was. A scarred map that showed paths that books never could. Even so, the prejudice did not disappear overnight. One of the directors, bothered by the former Doorman's silent success, suggested in a meeting that the presentations be supervised by someone more aligned with the company's institutional language. It was a subtle attempt at control, disguised as bureaucracy. The CEO listened to the proposal. He paused and replied, "When you have a life-saving field, resume in 5 languages, and can still teach with humility, we'll talk." Word spread. And for the first time, those who had been laughing at Henry began to feel disconcerted. But he never celebrated. At the end of each day, he would return home the same way. Walking a few blocks to the station, backpack on his shoulders, the same simple sandwich in his lunchbox. Sometimes he would catch the same bus as the cleaning staff and greet everyone by name. There, no one needed to know about positions. He was just Henry. And perhaps that was where he felt most complete. But recognition began to spread beyond the company walls. A local university contacted him. A social project asked for his presence as a mentor. A partner company requested an external lecture. And, little by little, what was supposed to be a one-off gesture by the CEO became a national reference for transformation within corporations. The employees themselves began to change the way they communicated. There was more respect in the hallways. People who had previously ignored each other now listened. Even the looks in their eyes changed. Less judgment, more curiosity. And Henry, who had been called old, outdated, and invisible, was now the bridge between generations, departments, cultures, and ideas. This was her true mission, to show that true wisdom is not taught on a whiteboard. It is shared in silence with those who have scars, but chose to continue building. Write in the comments. Wisdom comes from those who have lived. Because the greatest title anyone can have is the respect earned without having to impose oneself. The lights in the auditorium were already on when Henry walked in, carrying only a thin leather briefcase in his hands. His neat blazer and calm gaze gave no indication of his racing heart. That morning, he would not be just the former doorman turned consultant. He would be heard by more than 500 people. Directors, investors, leaders of large corporations, people he had only seen from behind for years as he opened doors. He was greeted with a firm but distant handshake. The smiles were polite but not spontaneous. There was a restrained respect, the kind that is offered when protocol demands it, not when the heart approves. He knew this, and yet he walked onto the stage without hesitation. Around him, famous names circulated between one cocktail party and another. There were representatives of multinationals, journalists, influential figures, but at that moment, all eyes were on him. The silence in the room was absolute. Henry began his speech simply, without PowerPoint, without sound bites. He said his name, his current role, and then, with a slight adjustment of the microphone, he said firmly, "Before that, I was a doorman. And before that, I was invisible." A small movement in the audience. Curious glances crossed. Then he dove in. He told of the wars he translated with language, not guns. Of the soldiers he helped save with a single, well-timed phrase. Of the days when, even though he was fluent in 5 languages, he couldn't get a job as a waiter. "They said I was too old. Then they said I was too qualified. Then they said I didn't fit in." The words cut through the air like a razor. But there was a calmness in his voice that made everything seem more serious, because there was no hate, only memory. I was told not to care what people thought of me, but when you hear for years that your worth is gone, you start to believe it. Pause. Silence. A soft sigh echoed from the front row. For a long time I thought my time had passed, until someone, in the middle of a crowded building, looked me in the eye and said, "Tell me your story." Yi, that's when the entire auditorium leaned forward slightly, as if, unconsciously, trying not to miss a single comma. I'm not the only one. There are people at the reception desk of your building, at the counter of your cafe, on the bus of your route, who speak more languages than your international manager. People who have had more experiences than can fit on a resume, but who were buried alive in the label you placed on them. The hardened faces began to give way. One or another cleaned their glasses. Today, my title is beautiful, but my real role is to make you look again. Look differently. Because sometimes the greatest expert in human connection is holding a door that you pretend not to see. Spontaneous applause broke out for a few seconds, and then he finished with a phrase that no one there would forget. It's not about where they put you. It's about what you carry when you get there. When he got off the stage, he was greeted with hugs that seemed like apologies. Even the most skeptical people stood up, and at that moment, he no longer needed to prove anything. But what moved Henry most came later, in the silence at the end of the event, when he was already leaving through the side door. A young man, a security guard at the venue, ran up to him, holding back emotion in his eyes. "Sir, I also serve coffee, but I speak Russian and Japanese. I've never had the courage to tell anyone that." Henry shook his hand firmly. "Don't leave that courage for later." The next day, he returned to his routine. Same station, same black coffee without sugar. He passed by the company reception, and there was the new doorman, young, quiet, with the same eyes he had had years before. Henry stopped, looked him in the eye, and said with a sincere smile, "Good morning. It's a pleasure to see you here." And with that simple gesture, the wheel began to turn again, but with a new rhythm. Because what Henry understood, and now taught, was that opening doors is more than turning a doorknob. It's creating space where before there was only silence. Comment here: every story deserves to be heard. Because change sometimes starts with the people you least expect it to. At the exact moment someone chooses to listen. There's a video here that complements all of this. Click and continue with me there. The next story may move you in the same way, or even more.